Welcome to our deep dive into societal conditioning and the concept of dungeon programming. Now, I know what you're thinking. Pharrell dungeon programming sounds a bit heavy, doesn't it? And you'd be right, it is. But stick with me. Today, we'll explore how power hierarchies are maintained and individuals' autonomy is limited through systemic frameworks. We're talking about the invisible bars, the carefully constructed walls of this societal dungeon we all inhabit. Let's talk about the prey role. We are born into this world bright-eyed and full of wonder, only to be bombarded with messages about our place in it. From a young age, media, education, even our favorite bedtime stories subtly reinforce societal hierarchies. We are conditioned to be good little consumers, to chase the dangling carrot of success, defined of course by someone else's terms. We're taught to respect authority, not to question the system. Now, there's nothing inherently wrong with respecting authority, but blind obedience, that's where the dungeon masters want you. They need you to accept your role, to stay in your lane. Don't worry, there's a whole separate lane for questioning things. It's called conspiracy theorist, and it's just over there. See, the dungeon thrives on predictability. Now, let's shine a light on some of the dungeon's favourite tools, predatory institutions. We're talking about those charming folks who offer you a helping hand while picking your pocket with the other. Payday loan companies, whispering sweet nothings of instant cash while burying you in interest rates that would make a loan shark blush. Manipulative advertising, convincing you that you're incomplete without their product, that happiness comes in the form of a new car or the latest smartphone. And let's not forget unjust labour practices where corporations squeeze every ounce of productivity out of you while paying you just enough to survive, but never enough to thrive. The dungeon loves a captive audience, and what's more captivating than the promise of a better life, even if it's just out of reach? Now, who are these dungeon masters we keep mentioning? Well, it's not one person in a hooded cloak, although that would make for a much cooler story. No, the predator role in this scenario is a bit more nuanced. We're talking about those who benefit most from the current system, those who hold the keys to the dungeon, so to speak. Governments that prioritize corporate interests over the needs of the people, elites who manipulate economic policies to line their own pockets while the rest of us struggle to make ends meet. And yes, even media outlets that prioritize sensationalism and fear-mongering over factual reporting, keeping the population divided and distracted. They're the architects of the dungeon, constantly reinforcing its walls, ensuring the status quo remains firmly in place. Chapter 4, Predator versus Victim Class and Power Struggles. Let's be clear, the dungeon thrives on the illusion of a level playing field, but the reality is it's more like a rigged game, with the predator and victim roles carefully defined. The wealthy elite, the top 1%, they wrote the rule book. They used the system to extract wealth and labour from the lower classes, leaving them with the scraps while they feast at the top. They talk about bootstraps while standing on mountains of inherited wealth, conveniently forgetting that the ladder to success was pulled up right behind them. This isn't about individual blame, it's about recognizing the systemic forces at play, the way the dungeon is designed to keep certain groups down. Chapter 5, Prey upon Media Manipulation. Now let's talk about one of the dungeon's most insidious tools, media manipulation. See, it's not enough to just control the narrative, you have to control the information itself. The media in all its forms has become incredibly adept at preying upon people's fears and insecurities. They bombard us with carefully curated stories designed to keep us distracted, divided, and most importantly, consuming. They tell us what to be afraid of, who to be angry at, all while subtly reinforcing those same societal hierarchies that benefit the dungeon masters. Don't get me wrong, there's fantastic journalism out there, but it's often drowned out by a tidal wave of clickbait and fear-mongering. Remember, a distracted population is a compliant population. Here's the truly insidious part about the dungeon. It's self-perpetuating. The cycle of predator and victim ensures that these power structures are passed down from generation to generation. People born into lower socioeconomic classes are often conditioned to accept their roles, to believe that their circumstances are a result of their own shortcomings rather than systemic barriers. Meanwhile, those born into privilege are taught to preserve their advantages, often unaware of the invisible hand that helped them up the ladder. This isn't about guilt. It's about understanding how the dungeon is designed to maintain the status quo. Now, let's talk about some of the more respectable predators in the dungeon social institutions. We're talking about schools, religious organizations, even community groups that, while often well-intentioned, can inadvertently reinforce the dungeon's programming. Educational systems, for example, can condition students to accept authority without questioning, to prioritize conformity over critical thinking. They prepare them to fit neatly into those predetermined roles within the dungeon, rather than encouraging them to challenge the very structure itself. Let's be clear, the dungeon thrives on division. It's much easier to control a population that's too busy fighting amongst itself to recognize the bars of its cage: race, religion, gender, sexual orientation, even something as trivial as your favorite sports team. These are all tools used to divide and conquer. We're constantly bombarded with messages designed to make us fear and distrust the other, to view our fellow prisoners as the enemy rather than recognizing the real threat, the dungeon itself. Remember, a united front is much harder to control than a fractured one. Thank you for joining us on this exploration of societal conditioning and dungeon programming. It's not easy confronting these uncomfortable truths, but awareness is the first step towards dismantling the bars of this metaphorical prison. Remember, breaking free from these patterns requires collective awareness and action. We need to start questioning the narratives we're fed, challenging the systems that benefit the few at the expense of the many. It's time to escape the dungeon together. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more insightful content.